So by now we've looked at quite a few Ford games on this channel. Ford Truck Mania, Ford Street Racing, Ford v Chevy, but now it's time to go back where it all began, with the original Ford Racing on the original PlayStation. A game so aggressively average that it somehow becomes memorable because of its averageness. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, then I play them, review them, and rank them. Last week we had the incredibly bare bones and average Formula GP for the original PlayStation. And this week, yes, the Worst Racing Games wheel has blessed us with the original Ford Racing game. So buckle in, ladies and gents, because this should be a very entertaining ride. So this was released in January 2001 on the original PlayStation and had arrived just a little while earlier for PC players. Ford Racing arrived right at the tail end of the PS1's life cycle. By this point, developers had kind of already squeezed basically every ounce of power out of that little grey box. We'd already seen games that looked phenomenal for the hardware. We'd seen arcade racers, simulations, open road racers, rally games. Every possible style of driving game had pretty much already been explored on the system. So naturally, Empire Interactive, the publisher, looked at the state of the racing genre and said, you know what people want? 11 Ford cars and 4 tracks repeated 100 billion times. And honestly, fair enough for the attitude, I guess. So Ford Racing was ported over to the PlayStation by Toolbox Design, and the original PC version was handled by Elite Systems. Toolbox Design themselves are kind of fascinating because they don't really have any other notable credited works. This is essentially their big moment in the spotlight, and well, it kind of feels like a one-hit wonder that wasn't really much of a hit. Publishing duties were handled by Empire Interactive, who, if you've played enough budget racing games from the early 2000s, you've definitely encountered them before. They went on to publish many more Ford racing games, along with absolute fever dreams like Big Mother Truckers. And I think that kind of tells you the exact kind of game we're dealing with here. Nothing particularly high-end, let's just put it that way. This is very much you saw this in a bargain bin for $9.99, and you had a budget of £10, so you just bought it. That's the kind of game we got here. But I guess maybe it's part of the charm. There is something deeply nostalgic to me about these lower tier licensed racing games from this console. Developers knew they couldn't compete directly with giants from the genre, so they just leaned entirely on branding. And of course in this case, that branding is Ford. So starting off with a positive, one thing Ford Racing actually gets surprisingly right is the menu presentation. And I know that sounds ridiculous because nobody buys a racing game for the menus, but hear me out because we've got to cover the complete package. The menus here are surprisingly slick. Everything has this very clean blue Ford branded aesthetic, the Ford logo sits subtly in the background, and there's a sort of pseudo-corporate presentation style to everything. It genuinely feels like, to me at least, that the game is trying to present itself as a serious racing simulator. Not necessarily a hardcore sim, but definitely something more grounded than an arcade racer. Especially once you get into the career mode, the game starts showing you track previews, prize money, race info, upgrade details. There is an attempt at immersion here, and honestly, for a budget PS1 racing game, it does a decent job creating that motorsports weekend atmosphere. There's practice sessions, qualifying, the actual race, obviously. That structure alone already separates it slightly from the pure arcade crowd. Now granted, you can skip practice and qualifying entirely if you just want to speedrun your suffering, but the fact that the systems exist at all is kind of a win in my books. It's not groundbreaking menu design by any means, but it's clean, it's sleek, and it fits the Ford branding fairly well. So let's talk game modes. Ford Racing keeps things fairly straightforward when it comes to game modes. Quick Race is split into 3 sections: single race, time trial, and head-to-head split screen. Pretty self-explanatory stuff, let's face it. The split screen mode is honestly probably where the game is the most enjoyable because bad racing games are always more entertaining when another human is involved and you're not just sat alone in misery and silence. like I was. There's something magical about laughing at terrible AI and weird physics together. But anyway, the real focus here is the career mode. It's the main attraction, or at least it's supposed to be. Career mode has you progressing through various championships and car classes while earning money to buy upgrades. Very Gran Turismo inspired. You earn credits, you improve the car, you move into faster events. On paper, it sounds perfectly fine. In execution, on the other hand, is where the game slowly starts driving directly into a barrier. One of the first issues becomes obvious almost immediately. The game locks most of the interesting cars away at the start, so if you boot up the game hoping to immediately drive a Mustang or the GT90, which is cool by the way, tough luck. You're starting with the slower everyday vehicles, and look, I understand progression systems, I understand rewarding the player, but there's a difference between progression and punishment. The early game cars here just are not interesting or exciting or remotely fun to drive. In fact, it's so boring as some sick joke or twist, the game has you start with the Ford Ka, or the Ford Ka, or the Ford Car, however you say it, that little bubble of joy that was everywhere on the roads in the late 90s and early 2000s, is in this game. And oh my god, it is so boring. It really just puts a really sour taste in your mouth as you start playing this game, because you're stuck with this thing for a little while. You've got a whole championship season to complete just driving this boring bubble of pure boredom. You just spend a lot of time crawling around tracks in this car and it feels sluggish, whilst the game is trying to convince you it's thrilling motorsport. And because the career mode is so rigid, you don't really have much freedom. You can't pick the car, you can't choose the colours, you just follow the game's structure exactly as it tells you to, like a good little boy. Race these events, earn points, move on, repeat. There is no personality or experimentation. It feels strangely sterile. And then there's the upgrade system. It's one of those mechanics that sounds more exciting than it actually ends up being. You can buy better tyres, tune the engine a little bit, change the suspension a little bit, gearbox a little bit. Again, it sounds fairly in-depth, but the problem is the game never really demands that level of engagement from you. You can literally just go through the entire game without touching the menus once, and you'll be fine. Most races are incredibly easy. Like, very easy. The only reason you're going to fail is if, like me, you're really bad at finding the racing line. You can usually blast through the pack within the opening lap without much resistance, so if you don't want to qualify, you don't have to, because you'll probably overtake them all before turn 1. So, even though the game offers all of these upgrade options, there's not really any real motivation to give a shit. You never feel pushed, you never feel challenged, you're just going through the motions of a championship. So let's talk about the actual handling in this game, because it kind of doesn't get any better. It's not even offensively bad, it's just really, really dull. Bad games can still be entertaining, but this game just kind of exists at some point. The actual driving mechanics are weirdly competent at first glance. The cars feel responsive, the steering is relatively tight, and the controls are of course very easy to understand. But after a few races, you realise the handling model is definitely too forgiving. Cars basically never spin out, mistakes are very easy to recover from, and I would know because I make many of them, and you can take terrible racing lines and still get away with it. The game wants to feel realistic aesthetically, but mechanically it leans much more toward arcade racing, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the tracks and AI were actually designed around that style, but of course, they are not. The AI in this game is genuinely some of the most lifeless racing AI on the entire console. The CPU drivers follow rigid racing lines like they're attached to invisible rails. In fact, you may as well be racing trains. They barely react to your presence, they barely react to each other, and if you happen to be occupying the same space they want to drive through, they'll simply just push you off the track. There's no intelligence, no adaptability, no aggression in a fun way. Just robotic movement. And the collision detection makes this even worse, because this is a classic case of bad racing game having bad collision detection. There's like a good few inches leeway between you actually touching the car but the game thinking you've touched the car. It's very strange. Cars can hit you despite visibly not touching you. Rear-end collisions can magically slow your vehicle down or launch you in bizarre ways. The entire thing just feels ever so slightly disconnected from reality, which becomes a huge problem in a racing game where it's trying to make you feel like precision matters. So you can never really trust the physics or the collisions, and because the AI behaves so mechanically, races just lose any sense of excitement. You're not battling opponents and having a fun race, you're just moving past these generic obstacles. And then we get to the tracks, and I can't even be bothered with this, guys. The tracks. This might honestly be the weakest part of the entire package. There are technically 8 tracks in this game, but 4 of them are actually unique. The others are basically just reversed layouts, and even the original 4 tracks are painfully forgettable. They lack any sense of identity, any memorable corners, or any atmosphere at all, and turns often feel randomly placed rather than naturally flowing. It's like one of the designers just got their kids to make up a random shape, and then they just handed it in and called it a day. There is no rhythm to the circuit design, no iconic looking sections, no sense that these are real locations, and because corner cutting is so lenient, you can often just ignore these racing lines, which removes any satisfaction from the game. Learning tracks should feel rewarding, and mastering corners should also feel rewarding, but the game just never really gives you that satisfaction. You just sort of drive around these really stupidly designed shapes with very generic environments. And to me, that's ultimately the biggest issue with this game. There's just nothing here to make it stand out. Nothing about it feels bad enough to become iconic, at least for me. It's just aggressively average at absolutely everything, which weirdly makes it harder to talk about, because at least disastrous games can give me something to scream about. Ford Racing just kind of gives me mild disappointment, but there is still a strange PS1 era charm to it. Maybe it's the simplicity, maybe it's the low budget ambition, or maybe it's just the nostalgia for an era where developers would make entire games around a single car manufacturer. Now, visually, Ford Racing sits in a really awkward position on the system, because by 2001, obviously people already knew what the system was capable of. There were 2 Gran Turismos, you had Ridge Racer Type 4, Need for Speed games, even games like Colin McRae Rally were showing just how atmospheric and detailed racing games on the PS1 could actually look. So when you load up Ford Racing, it does kind of feel like a step backwards. Now, to be fair, the game does run very smoothly. The frame rate is stable, and that is very important in a racing game. A stable racing game with simpler visuals will always feel better to play than a visually impressive racer that chugs every time a car enters the screen. So clearly, they prioritize performance over detail. The problem is that the compromises become incredibly obvious also immediately. The car models themselves are fine, you can generally recognize what each vehicle is supposed to be. The Focus looks like a Focus. The Ka, unfortunately, still looks like a Ka. So from a licensing perspective, the game does its job. But compared to what Gran Turismo was doing like 2 years earlier, these models do feel kind of basic. There's very little detail and the polygon counts are noticeably low. And the way that those polygons are connected becomes distractingly visible during races. If you just take a look at the car models, they look like they've been assembled from slightly mismatched Lego pieces. Again, it's not like it's game-breaking or catastrophically terrible, it's just kind of rough on the eyes. And then there are the track environments, and that's where the game really struggles in my opinion. Most of the tracks feel bizarrely empty. Large sections of scenery are completely devoid of any detail. Stretches of flat textures, bland backgrounds, and environments that barely feel alive. There's very little atmosphere. There's definitely no memorable landmarks or crowds worth noticing. The circuits feel less like actual racetracks and more like temporary testing grounds floating in the void in between racing seasons. The skyboxes are also kind of bad, I'm not gonna lie, they look kind of unfinished. It's like somebody accidentally rendered a rough draft texture and then nobody ever noticed before the disc actually went out. I don't know, maybe I'm being too harsh on the visuals. On the plus side, some of the later tracks actually do look slightly better, not dramatically better, but you can tell they slowly became more comfortable squeezing visuals out of the hardware as they progressed making the game. The issue is that even the best looking track in this game would probably rank among the worst environments in Gran Turismo or Ridge Racer, and that's the unfortunate reality. This was a genre packed with absolute game changers at the time, so being just fine or barely acceptable was not enough, and Ford Racing is basically the gaming embodiment of the word fine. So let's talk about the sound design. The soundtrack is peak early 2000s budget racing game energy. Techno-inspired beats, repetitive drum loops, generic electronic tracks that feel like they were generated in a lab specifically designed to create extreme sports music. Nothing is offensively bad, but nothing is particularly noticeable or memorable either. It's just kind of there in the background, constantly looping endlessly, while you slowly question your life choices during another painfully average and slow championship race. And because the tracks repeat so often, the music starts becoming weirdly hypnotic, and I don't mean that in a good way like when you enter this rhythm state of driving, it's the I've been trapped in this menu listening to the same beat for 20 minutes kind of way. Still, I'll give the soundtrack this, it does at least fit the era, so if they're after a pat on the back, they get that from me. The bigger issue though is the engine audio. For a game built entirely around one car manufacturer, you'd expect the vehicles to have distinct personalities, but most of these cars sound bizarrely similar. There's a sort of generic bass-heavy hum attached to almost every vehicle. Everything kind of blends together in terms of sounds, and I think that's a huge missed opportunity. Part of the appeal of car culture is personality. The sound of it, the identity of it, the feeling of it. Ford Racing reduces most of its vehicles down to slightly different shapes, producing roughly the same noise. Which again reinforces this big issue that the game doesn't have any identity. Nothing about Ford Racing feels uniquely Ford beyond the branding itself. Now, in terms of critical response, I'm sure you can probably guess, but this game did not exactly set the world on fire. The PlayStation version holds a 53 out of 100 on Metacritic, which honestly feels about right. What's even better and funnier is that the PS1 version actually scored slightly higher than the PC version. Not by much, literally by 2 points, but still, that's probably the most surprising achievement this game has. As for sales though, the game actually performed a lot better than I was expecting going into playing this. According to estimates from VG Charts, Ford Racing sold approximately 860,000 copies, which for a lower budget licensed racing game is not bad at all. And that would explain why the series kept going for so long, because despite the very bad reviews, there clearly was an audience for manufacturer-focused racing games. Especially during the early 2000s when car culture games were absolutely everywhere. So now the time has come to rank Ford Racing on our worst racing games tier list. The thing with Ford Racing is that it at least functions as a racing game. It does the things it kind of sets out to do, it just does them in a very boring and bland way. So I think Ford Racing on PS1 is actually going to join its other Ford Racing friends in the meh category, so with Ford Truck Mania and Ford Street Racing. It's just super average. It's boring, there's nothing exciting. I really don't have much else to say about it, to be honest. I'm really starting to run out of words. Despite everything I've said, I don't actually hate it, and I think that is important, because there is a difference between a really bad game and just a really boring, mediocre one. It's not broken, it's not unplayable, not a technical disaster, it's just kind of forgettable. And to be honest, after I finish editing this video, I don't think I'm going to think about this game ever again. I think the best comparison I can make of this game is that Ford Racing is the video game equivalent of room temperature water. If you're incredibly thirsty and you have no other options, you'll drink it. But realistically, there are about 100 better options in the fridge right by it. And unfortunately for Ford Racing, those better options were literally available on the same console. Anyway, that takes us to the end of our look at Ford Racing for the original PlayStation. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of this game? Have you played it, are you going to go and play it now, and would you rank it any differently? And as always, if you have a suggestion for the wheel, pop that in the comments down below as well. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.